there's just the standard push and pull where companies always threaten to leave because they're not getting exactly what they want, or that. But the second is, the politicization of everything, right? In particular for sort of Paramount Warner Brothers, with Larry Ellison being such a prominent supporter of Donald Trump. I almost want to ask them, did you not think there would be consequences? Like, is it shocking that Democrats, having seen these doors open, or not being reluctant to do things, are going to do these things themselves? Like, I'm not surprised. I don't know why they would be.
Gautam, I'm curious on that point in particular, what test do you believe that policymakers should use to distinguish between a legitimate warning and basically an incumbent reinforcing its position? Like, how do you see that, and how should policymakers really view that?
Yeah, so that's the trick, right? Because businesses always say that, and I mean, the worst offenders are sports teams, but there's this constant sort of strain of like, yeah, I'll leave if I don't get X, tax benefits, whatever. I think the clear test we have to understand is this something that I'm doing because it's a special favor that favors incumbents and blocks new entrants? Or is this a policy that I think is actually good for business climate in general, in particular would be good for new entrants? I have to say is that the distinction here is what is good for business is not necessarily what is good for business. And California is sort of the best example of that, because California is Silicon Valley and is the center of global innovation because it kind of accidentally stumbled into not enforcing non-competes. Without that, Silicon Valley doesn't take shape the way it does at all. But businesses, incumbent businesses, established businesses, they love non-competes, and they always fight any attempt to get rid of them. And that's sort of a big tell, right? That whatever they might be saying, this isn't about being good for business in general. It's just good for me.
It's interesting because you think about the technology industry globally, and why has it been so, successful in Silicon Valley and not in, say, the Europe or UK? And a lot of folks say it's just been the light regulatory touch of the U.S. and maybe even the state of California. That's seen as a good thing, right?
Yeah, so it's not just the light regulatory touch, it's the right regulatory touch, right? And we got to distinguish that, because if you were to go back to 1955 or 1960 and ask, where is the computer revolution going to happen? Where is the next that's going to happen? You wouldn't have picked California. You would have picked Route 128 in Massachusetts, where there was a much more favorable configuration of events than what happened in Silicon Valley, except for the regulatory environment, right? Boston, Massachusetts enforced non-competes. They enforced them strongly, and that really did drive new businesses into California, where they could create this sort of intellectual hub, right? So saying we will not enforce non-competes from the perspective of an incumbent business, that's a really unfavorable regulation, right? That's not a light touch. That's a pretty strong thing that they don't like. It was just really good for the environment. It was really good for business in general. And so we really, really need to, when we think about these things, to drill in on this question is, are you doing special pleading, or are you saying I'm actually something that's good for everybody?
Yeah, Route 128 in Mass is pretty good, but Silicon Valley really came from, guess where? New Jersey. Menlo Park, California, where did that come from? Menlo Park, New Jersey. Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley, where did that come from? Sand Hill Road in New Jersey. The Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University. I think this guy, Albert Einstein, that's where it all started. But these guys wanted better weather, so they all went out to California. That's the history.
I am a Stanford graduate, so this is all music to my ears.
I love dressing down these smart young guys out in Silicon Valley over the last 40 years when they tell me how smart they are. Like,
please,
guys, you could have been in Jersey.
We need to be humbled, I think. Gautam, another follow-up question on that, because I think that's a really fascinating point. How much causal weight can you really put on sort of the regulatory environment in California as opposed to Stanford, as opposed to immigration, venture capital, network effects?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question, right? So these things are always multi-causal, and you can't, if some other state or country just adopted California's regulatory environment wholesale, maybe they would get some improvements, but they're not going to get Silicon Valley, right? So there's clearly a complex ecology of systems there, everything down to the weather. I mean, like, who wouldn't rather have California weather than Boston weather, right? Like, there is a differential between those two. But we shouldn't understate the role of that right regulatory environment, because there are lots of other places in the country, in the United States, that had the same federal regulatory environment, that had the same sort of government technology investment, that had same access to the same sort of educated people. Stanford's wonderful, but it's not better than the combination of Harvard and MIT that Massachusetts had, right? But Silicon Valley still happens in California. So we have to think about regulation as a key factor. And sort of this is, a big driver for people in Silicon Valley right now who are sort of saying, the government is always in our way. The government is always the problem. I'm like, you guys are creations of the government, right? Every single technology that Silicon Valley is based on has its foundation in U.S. government labs, without exception. And sort of pretending that all of this could happen without the nurturing arms of the United States taxpayer is, it's ahistorical. It's frankly delusion.